Well, welcome everybody to this IAS Distinguished Lecture. I'm Cameron Campbell. I'm the Acting Dean of Humanities and Social Science, and I'm really happy and pleased today to be able to welcome Peter BOL, the Charles Cartwell Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, who's going to be talking to us about the digital humanities and Chinese history. I'd like to introduce, many of you are probably already well aware of Peter's many accomplishments, but to summarize them briefly, his research is centered on the history of China's cultural elites at the national and local levels from the 17th to the 17th century, or 7th to the 17th century. He's written several books as an author or co-author, including This Culture of Ours, Intellectual Transitions in Tang and Song China, Neo-Confucianism in History, and Song Dynasty Uses of the I Ching. He's also the co-editor of Ways with Words, and he's published multiple articles in Chinese, Japanese, and in English. And perhaps most importantly, at least in terms of the relevance to the talk today and his visit to HKUST, Peter, for decades, has been a relentless advocate for the development and the use of tools for the application or the use of digital humanities in the study not only of Chinese history, but in the humanities more generally. He's led multiple international collaborations, various networks, and so forth. And there are two projects in particular that I would like to highlight. He directs the China Historical GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, project, a collaboration between Harvard and Fudan, which has created a database of, geographic information, including place names, boundaries, and so forth, for 2,000 years of Chinese history. Many of us have probably used maps or other geospatial information from the CHGIS. I certainly have. And then in a ongoing collaboration that's been actually going for quite a while between Harvard, the Academia Sinica, and Peking University, he directs the China Biographical Database Project, again, which I suspect many of you are familiar with or may have used already, a vast online relational database that currently contains information about 400,000 historical figures from Chinese history mainly before the 20th century. And it's currently being expanded, and Peter just told me today that I guess some of our data that we had shared had been integrated into the database, and it covers really 2,000 years. And on a more personal note, I'd just like to add that Peter has a long time been a friend of HKUST and our School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Various deans, James Lee, Kelly Tsai, myself, have sort of been counseled by Peter on issues related to digital humanities and Chinese history, and he's visited the school on various occasions, so it's really great to have him back here to present this lecture. So, Peter, why don't you go ahead?
No, I have they've given me a mic here. Thank you all very much for coming. So I should tell you that I'm an intellectual historian, right? I was really by chance that around 25 years ago, I got involved in a couple projects that today, but not then, we call digital humanities, or DH as I'll abbreviate it. And I've been made possible, these projects, by other people who had greater technical knowledge than I had or greater domain knowledge. And I've depended on them and benefited from them. And perhaps this gives me some perspective on the ways in which the digital humanities is changing the way we think about the past, think about history, and how historians do history. Now, had I been preparing this talk a year or a year and a half ago, I would have said that DH, digital humanities, is moving history away from the humanities and into the social sciences. But this last year, as I have seen what we can do with easy-to-use artificial intelligence tools, and now with the more sophisticated ways of employing AI, I am no longer sure this is so. And so my talk today is going to have, I have to turn it on first. There we go. It's going to have two parts. The first part is really is what I fully understand, which is the use of digital humanities techniques in ways that move the materials of the past, whence we know about the past, and the ways in which we study the past from the humanities into the social sciences, and in particular the quantitative social sciences, and how this solves the problem of biographical history. The problem of biographical history, which is the collection of anecdotes. For this, I'll give particular attention to the China Biographical Database, which Professor Campbell has already alluded to. And the second part of the talk is the part that I only grasp in part, which is the use of artificial intelligence techniques that moves us away, historians away from in their study of the past, from the quantitative social sciences back towards the humanities. But it also, in its own way, solves the problem of biographical history, that it is a collection of anecdotes rather than a coherence. This is sort of a clever way of putting it, but being a humanist, I can be clever. What are the humanities? How should we define them? And I think, and this is not arbitrarily, I want to define the humanities as ways in which we express or represent meaning, primarily through language. And thus we have literature, but also through image, the art, and through sound and music. Meaning is created through the relationship between words, images, sounds, and one might say that the study of them is the study of those relationships. This works, I think, for literature, for art, for music. Does it work for philosophy? Well, in some cases, yes. Here's a great philosopher, Hobbes, and his introduction to the Leviathan, where he says, and highlighted here, geometry, the only science that it hath pleased God hitherto to bestow on mankind. And that what he argues in this is that words only have meaning relative to other words, right? And that if you want to make an argument, a philosophical argument, you basically begin from your definitions. Right? Words exist in relationship to other words. But for historians, I think we believe that the words point to things out there, on the other side of the words, in some world of people like us, of some lived reality. And I guess I would illustrate this with the following. And oh yes, and my historian in this case is Thucydides, right? Who, in talking about why Coursera fell into its component parts, uses this phrase, which has always stuck with me. He says, the agreed upon currency of words for things was subjected to random barter. In other words, people no longer agreed what words meant, right? And they made it up as they pleased, which is pretty much describing American politics today, right? Words have become subject to random barter. And it is cause for concern. Now, history, to explain this, and also to suggest why history doesn't really fit perfectly with the humanities, take this picture. This is a picture that somebody, an historian, used in a lecture once, in a lecture where she was on a panel with art historians. And she began by talking about Empress Cao of the Song Dynasty, the 11th century, and her ladies in waiting, and talking about her life. And the art historians looked at it and said, well, that's not exactly how we would look at the painting. You're seeing through the painting to a history, to a person. We don't know that that person is even real. What we see is a painting. We see images, we see colors, we see arrangement, we see all sorts of things that have to do with the relationship between those things and that image. That's what's real. That's what survived. I have no idea whether Empress Cao ever existed, says the art historian. And the historians say, well, the painting is a painting of Empress Cao, and she had this life, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the way in which historians, I think, have a tense relationship, if you will, with the humanities. right? And the way in which the humanities operate. Now, we look through the painting. We look through the words to a history, to a reality that we think is there. We think is there. We believe is there. We try to justify it and find evidence for it. For historians, words, images, sounds are means to know things that are not in the words, images, and sounds. Now, I think when literature first began to turn to DH, and here with the work of Franco Moretti, in fact, what it discovered was that it, too, was taking literature and turning it into social science. Note the work of Franco Moretti's first important book on this, Graph, Maps, and Trees, right? The visualization methods of the social sciences, or his work on distant reading, which is the idea that you can read 1,000 books at once with the proper digital methods, right? Both of these, in effect, are turning literature into social science, into something quantitative. It is also perhaps why I talked to him once about this, and I said, he was comparative literature. This book set out to Graphs, Maps, and Trees to look at the history of the novel. And he made the point that you can't begin, in his lifetime, he could not read 3,000 novels. So he needed other ways of trying to see the picture of all the novels together. He had become, in effect, a social scientist, right? And left the humanities, which explains why, as he told me, when I asked him how his colleagues in comparative literature responded, he said that was one of the most saddest things in his life, that they thought he was nuts, right? That what he was doing was not worthwhile. But I think he's had an impact nevertheless. Now, I bring up quantitative and social science history for 3 reasons. First, because I'm an intellectual historian, and I'm probably as far away among historians from the quantitative and social science methods of anyone. And this is my excuse for the mistakes I make. Second, because I'm here in Hong Kong at the University of Science and Technology, and in fact, Hong Kong and this university are centers for the quantitative study of Chinese history. And third, because, as I said, the digital humanities has pushed the study of Chinese history and me towards a more quantitative approach. Now, I want to begin with the third point, that DH pushes historians towards a quantitative approach, and it does so fundamentally. This is a slide too early, so ignore it for the moment. But it does so fundamentally, I think, because the techniques of DH involve data. It involves converting text into data. And having data makes quantitative analysis possible. Thus, Moretti's distant versus close reading, which, to go back to the slide where I should be, his later book, Distant Reading, which tries to look at how you could read and analyze the language of large numbers of books at the same time. The methods of data analysis that DH historians apply are quantitative, fundamentally. They are the methods that were developed in the social sciences and natural sciences. What's new is that I think computation has made it possible to do them at scale. And they have been made into software packages, more importantly, software packages that humanists without quantitative skills can make use of. Geographic information systems is an example of this. So GIS, maps are very old. This is from 1136. The oldest, it's engraved on stone, still exists. The earliest extant grid map done for Chinese history, probably done in world history. But scientific mapping, which this looks like but is not, right, really only begins in 1784 with the Ramsden theodolite, right, which is why the Great Britain historical GIS begins in 1790. It's the point at which you have accurate mapping of Great Britain. And accurate mapping using theodolites of China doesn't begin till really around 1900. But geographic information systems in forms that are useful for a layman like me, right? These and where you can teach yourself how to do it, these don't really begin until the 1990s and late 1990s. It's very recent. Network analysis is old as well, but computation has made it new and better. And relational databases, and that is an example, of course, of network analysis, a more colorful example than the previous slide. This is from, well, as you can see there, it's from the mid-Ming, the social networks of 72 important scholars in relationship to their students. But relational databases, such as this, from the China Historical GIS, from the China Biographical Database, really began only in the 1980s. So these are all things, these techniques that really have been in my professional lifetime, after my PhD, in fact, have come into being. Now, I should say something about the China Historical GIS. Since I'm here, it's always good to give credit for the people who did all the work. It began, actually, my interest in began with work that the late Robert Hartwell did. Robert Hartwell at the University of Pennsylvania was a obsessed man, a crazy man, but one who was truly interested in social science history, and one of the first, along with Bill Skinner, one of the first important and influential American social science historians, quantitative historians. And although his work on GIS, historical GIS was supplanted, it provided the inspiration for the work that Harvard and Fudan did together. All these data layers, the time slices and the time series from Qinshi Huang, the Xinhai Geming, from 221 BC to 1911 are all available freely for download. And as long as you have GIS software, you can use them. For those of you who have not used GIS before, you can get Quantum GIS, QGIS. It's a free download, works on the Mac, works on your PC, and you can do whatever with it. And you can download all the data sets directly from Harvard, or you can go to Fudan and download them from there as well. And the important thing about a GIS is that you can take multiple layers of information and put them together. And this is an example of that, where we're using in green, you see the counties that in 1820 were listed as Chongxian, as busy counties. This is one of the 4 classifications of administrative units given the Qing dynasty. And the railroads, that's from the China W data set from G. William Skinner, or William G. Skinner, which you can download, again from CHGIS. We have the postal routes in red and yellow, revised by Chung Ro-ran from the London School of Economics, and the 1990 railroad. So we've taken different sources and put them together, which makes a very simple point, right? That the busy Xian were on transportation routes. The transportation routes have had a great deal of longevity. They provided the source for postal routes and for railroads as well, and superhighways and so on. I want to say something about the Lee Campbell's work on historical microdata. This is an article that I guess Professor Campbell wrote more or less, on 40 years of data set construction by the Lee Campbell Research Group and their various collaborators. And I bring this up to make a distinction. The distinction is this. A good number of 20 years ago or so, when I was talking to Professor Lee, James Lee, about the work we were thinking of doing for the China Biographical Database, he said, well, you know, Peter, he said, in building a database, the most important thing to do is to begin with a research question. You have to have a research question, because the research question will tell you what kinds of information you need to get, and it will tell you really how you have to think about organizing it, and these will be your guides. And I realized as he said that, and it was clear to me that Robert Hartwell, who also had done initial work on a biographical database for Chinese, that's how he thought too. His goal was to understand the social history and political history of court elites, of the highest elites, and he was gathering information for that purpose. But I understood that, in fact, I was not guided by a research question at all. I didn't have a research question in mind, and I didn't want to have one in mind. In fact, I was interested in building a platform that would allow for many different kinds of research questions. Or to put this another way, I wanted to build the library rather than to write the books. I wanted a platform that would serve many different kinds of history and many different historical questions. And so I should, at this point, do another acknowledgement for all those who've been involved in the past 20 years in the China Biographical Database Project. It's a true collaboration between Harvard, Peking University, and Academia Sinica. We have all contributed to it. We've had a series, this is the current executive committee, and we've had a series of project managers. Chen Sung, who's now a professor himself, Chen Shipei, who was stolen away by the Max Planck Institute to manage their digital assets, and currently for the last 10 years or so, Mr. Wang Hongsu, with Michael Fuller, who's actually a professor of literature, as the data architect, but he also happened to know computer science as well. It is a project that has users worldwide. When we began, I would say the red dots were sort of in the US and in Europe, and now, as you can see, the red dots have really moved east to the usage in China. 500,000 people over the course of the last few years. And what CBDB does, what the China Biographical Database does, what makes it a digital humanities project, is it aims to convert anecdote into data, saying that if you have enough anecdotes, you have data, right? You can start to see patterns. Let me clarify, though, what is the China Biographical Database? So contrary to what I realized that the blurb that Professor Campbell was giving about me was missing a number of things. One is which is that it's not 400,000 people at the moment in the database, but 640,000. That it includes their social associations, teachers, student, friend, office leader, subordinate, enemies, and so on. Biographical addresses of people, because people have many addresses. They're born somewhere, they die somewhere, they serve somewhere, and they move somewhere. Alternate names, I guess it's of great benefit that in China people have so many names, right? It's confusing, but it allows you to sort them out sometimes as well. A number of years ago, we had a meeting in England, organized by Anne Gerritsen, with the prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England and the prosopography of Byzantium, two earlier online biographical databases. And the people who do prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England face a particular problem. Most of the people in their database don't have surnames, right? They just have a personal name. And so you end up with things like William 375, right? In China, thank God, since the Han Dynasty, they've had surnames. Kinship relationships, an important feature. So a number of years ago, when we first were beginning, we organized a conference of everyone interested in China's biography and biographical databases, and a group came that represented a project called China Vitae, which is devoted to post-1949 biography. And as we were talking to them, and they gave a wonderful presentation. They're doing excellent work. And they have things like, how do you enter office, right? Do you pass examinations? Is it nepotism, the yin privilege? Or do you become an abbot of a monastery? How do you do that? Where are you posted to office? And here we have, as you can see, almost 2 million office postings. Social distinction, shall we Chufan? How are you known as in your time? As a merchant, as a monk, as a poet, and the text you wrote. So already almost 60,000 texts where people are authors, publishers, compilers, and so on. And the China Vitae had many of the same kinds of information. They said, well, that's interesting. I said, but there's one kind of information you don't have. You don't have any kinship information. Remember, kinship information is a really important part of anyone's biography. Right? And in fact, the standard rule for writing an epitaph, a muzhiming, for somebody in the past was you give 3 generations up and all living descendants. right? And for the wives, you try to give their husbands as well. And they had none of that. And I said, how is that possible? I mean, this is really important information. If you want to see social continuity, you need kinship. They said, yeah. They said, we know, but we've hired people in China, at universities in China, to gather all this information. And if they start to talk about the kinship of the leaders, they'll all be in trouble. So they've stopped the project since, because even not having kinship of the leaders was not enough to protect them from suspicion. So what do we do with such kinds of information? Well, one answer is it's used for prosopography, right? We conceive of people as sets of relationships. And I suppose I could go back to this slide and say, we rather than thinking of a person as somebody with a character and a career. So this is, again, why this is not really humanistic, right? We conceive of a person as the sum of their relationships to other people, social relationships, to family, to place, to career. And so we're modeling the life of a person in terms of relationships. It's not the only way to think about a person. A narrative biography is a wonderful thing, but that is not what we're doing. So we're doing instead what we would call, or what has been called, prosopography. In 1972, when the great English social historian Lawrence Stone gave this description of prosopography, it was before people were using computers, right? So we've gone from something which you could do perhaps with 100, 200 people, maybe more, to something where we can do it with hundreds of thousands of people, right? That's really thanks to computation. So again, this is not a dictionary of biography. I want to emphasize that, because people will look and say, but why couldn't you just use all this data to tell the story of a person's life? This isn't about a person's life. This is about the relationships that people have that allow us to relate them and compare them to other people. And to talk about that in terms of relationships and why a relational database matters, I want to just consider this for a minute. Suppose we have a person, right? And the person has been posted to a certain office. And the office is in a certain place. And the office has a certain title, right? Now, if we've organized things properly in a relational database, this means that we could say, for example, oh, this person served as a magistrate in this place. Now, tell me all the other people who served as magistrates in this place, or tell me all the people who had offices in this place when he was a magistrate. Or I could go and say this person has an association of a certain type with another person, right? But who else has associations with that person of that type, right? He says, oh, he's the student of somebody. Now I want to know who the other students of that somebody were. A relational database allows you to do that. The relational database is built on code tables and data tables, and that's its great strength and value, right? Now, I think that this helps us overcome an obstacle that Sima Qian faced. Sima Qian, in that famous letter to Renan, he ends the letter by talking about why he has done the Shiji. And remember, he had paid the price of castration rather than committing suicide, as he should have, for such a dishonor, in order to finish the Shiji. And he says, what did I want to do, right? What did I want to do? He says, well, I wanted to explore fully the interaction between heaven and man, right, the Tenrenjiji, and to show the continuity of transformations between past and present, become an independent discourse all my own, right? He asks important questions, right? How are human affairs related to the movements of the natural world, right, to the cosmos? How is the present connected to the past? But did he succeed? And I think, by and large, with the exception of some of the arguments he lays out in the Shu, which are the treatises later called the Zhi, right, in the Shiji, he doesn't really accomplish this. And he doesn't accomplish this because I think he got sucked into biography. The Shiji is 130 chapters long. 70 chapters are devoted to biography. And another, I think it's 30 chapters, are devoted to what are called shijia, right? The hereditary houses. So 100 chapters out of the 130 are devoted to biography. And the problem with biography, and the great thing about biography, is biography always takes the individual's point of view. So when you write a biography of somebody, you're taking that person and making that person central. And you see the world through the eyes of that person, which is not wrong. It's a wonderful thing. But it goes against trying to take all this information and put it into something that allows you to see the interactions of heaven and man, right? And the continuities and discontinuities between past and present. It is what I think digital humanities allows us to overcome, right? It's computation of relational, which is the basis for relational databases. They did not exist before computation. It's again from the 1980s. We can preserve the relationships between individuals and preserve the individual while still aggregating those individuals into larger patterns. The anecdote of individual biography becomes the basis for data, is transformed into data. There is a long history of elite biography in China. It is elite biography almost entirely. Various estimates, 250 detailed biographies altogether. Local gazetteers, the Difangzhi, mention probably around 2 million people. China has an exceptional history of compiling genealogy going back to the Sung dynasty 1,000 years ago. And in my view, Chinese history is perhaps one of the most important sources for the history of humanity. We can know more about more people over more area than anywhere else in the world. Which doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have a little bit to contribute. It does. I mean, if you go to Florence, it has an archive of 30,000 letters, right? Just from Florence from around 2 centuries. That's more letters than we have for the whole Sung dynasty, and slightly less letters than we have for the whole Ming dynasty. We have a project that's analyzing 50,000 Ming letters, but Florence, just one city, 30,000 letters over a couple centuries. That's extraordinary, but there's nothing that has national continuity like the Chinese historical record. We also draw in CBDB on many different sources. We have, these are just listing the number of sources per place, with the Ming dynasty having it the most, around 500 different sources. So we're drawing in from many places. We find our data in biographical indexes, such as the Sunren Zhuangji Ziliao Suoyin, things like this. There are also modern and pre-modern indexes of office holding. There are other biographical databases, the Mingjing Funyu Juzuo, the Mingjing Wen writing database, has been incorporated, or the biographical data has all been incorporated into CBDB. From Taiwan, the Mingqing name authority files have been incorporated. The Kyoto, Japan, Tang database has been incorporated. So we're more than happy to take other people's data if it's reliable. And that's why we've been able to take the Jinshan Lu data from the Lee Campbell group, the China Governmental Employees database. And I've just made a little slide here showing the distribution of Qing figures in the China Biographical Database at the moment. We've only, out of the 400,000 people in that database, we've only incorporated the 100,000 whose names do not appear in CBDB. There are another 300,000 who have names the same as people in our database. Probably only half of them are the same. You know, when we began this, I thought, oh, Chinese has so many characters. You know, there's no problem in disambiguation because everyone will have a unique name. It turns out not to be true, right? So some of you have already encountered this. So if your surname is Wang, right, king, and you have a son in the Ming dynasty, let's say, what do you think the best name for a son is? Remember, we're talking about elite biography. Anyone want to hazard a Professor Zhang, what do you think a good name for a son would be, for your son would be? If remember, your surname is Wang, not Zhang. Wang, what does every king need? Wang, Zi like son?
Yeah.
Ha! No, I haven't seen that one.
Okay.
You don't want to mess with that. No, but every Jun needs a Chun. Every king, yeah, I'll let them in. You can come in. Every king needs a minister. We have something like 70 Wang Chun in the biographical debates from the Ming Dynasty. And, we're missing data. We can't figure out who all of them are. Or there's another one, Wang Zi, an aide, not son in this case, but another, to aid to a king, and so on. Turns out, it's like all those people who in the Cultural Revolution were named Yue Jin, right? Great leap forward, right? It's the same sort of phenomenon. In any case, I digress. But we also have lots of cases where we need social associations and other kinds of information from biographical records, often unpunctuated, and so within which there are all sorts of sources that we can use. After all, if somebody writes a jiwen, that's a memorial, a prayer to somebody who's deceased, that shows they have an associationship, right? An association, so we can keep track of that. And this is an example. When we began, very early on, we realized that if we were to continue working at the pace we were working, it would take us between 80 and 200 years to get anywhere. And then I met a computer scientist. So I went from innocence and naivete and ignorance to somebody who said to me, do you know what regular expressions are? And I said, hello, goodbye, regular expression. How many of you know what a regular expression is? Okay, for many of you don't. So a regular expression is basically a string of text. Hi, Darlene. A string of text that in some ways can be predicted, is regular, has certain variables in it. And so if you do that, you can start to take a text like this, which is the beginning of a biography of Liu Zuchen from the 12th century, and you can start to isolate all sorts of parts of it and extract them computationally. So in yellow are names of various kinds. In green are offices. In turquoise are kinship relationships. In blue are place names. In purple are social associations. In red are means of entry into office, and so on. And so in these few sentences, we have an enormous amount of information stored up, right? All of which can go into that database using regular expressions. Extensive. It took us around half a year to write and test the Python codes for the regular expressions to deal with 25,000 biographies. And once we had done that, it took 3 days, right? So it speeded things up. Let's see, where am I? Slide 30. Okay, good. We're moving on. And so that's how we built a database of over 600,000 people, right? And the database is available in multiple formats. There's a user guide. You can download it for free. You can go to the website, which is bilingual in Chinese and English. You can access CBDB online. You can download the database and so on. Or you can go to the Yinda system online, which is the online query system where you won't have to download the whole thing. But if you do download it, and you're using Microsoft Access at this point as the interface, you can start to do various things with it. And the first thing that you're going to see is, besides all the kinds of code tables and data tables, is you're going to see that there are a whole set of queries that have been written up for you already. And I'm going to show you a couple of those. I'm not going to try to give you a workshop on the database, but this is basically the China Biographical Database over the years has developed various elaborate, complex queries. And so here's an example. So we're now looking at a kinship. And what we've decided to do is I've selected a person, but I could have selected more than one person, an important list. And the most important thing, perhaps, is that I'm going to specify the number of generations I want to see. So in this case, I've said, give me 4 generations of ancestors, father, 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 and 3 generations of descendants. Give me 1 marriage link, and give me 1 collateral link, and run the query, and I get 240 people. And then I say, well, because basically the computer's looping through, finding all these relationships that fit within those parameters. And then I say, do change this to an ego-relative kinship network. And then it says, oh, that's wife, wife, wife. He did have 3 wives. And in this case, we haven't said wife 1, 2, 3, but we could. The brothers, daughters, sons, daughters, husbands, brothers, sons, wives, and so on. And you actually have all that information there. And, oh yes, and then you can graph it. There are 4 different graphing programs that you could send this to, export to. You can send it to a GIS, right, and map it. So that's one of the, or you could just take the numerical data and just start to do numerical analysis with statistical analysis with it. Here's a very important one, which is social networks. Right? So you have to select a person, but I could have also decided to select a place, or select a person and select a place. So what you're seeing here is that all queries allow multiple variables, right? And you get to choose and define the variable. Now, I am to go through and I'm going to decide which are the associations I want to see. I've chosen Wang Shizhen from the Ming Dynasty, and I've decided I'm interested in friendship and religion, right? I want to see scholarship, but not the people who attacked him. I just want the people who liked him at the moment. And then I want to, I'm not interested in politics. I want to see the writings he does for other people, because that's a key kind of social association in the Chinese past, right? I write you a poem, I write you a letter, I write an inscription for you, and so on. And then I decide the node distance. So a friend is node 1. A friend of a friend is node 2. A friend of a friend of a friend is node 3, and so on. I would recommend against going beyond node 1 or 2. If you go to node 3 with Wang Shizhen, you will have in the order of 30,000 people. So, and it will take a while for the computer to loop through that. We set the number of loops so at 10, so you could have to increase the number of loops. And you can decide, do I want to look for dates? Do I want to use index years or use dynasties? And this said, I just want people in the Ming Dynasty. And this is the result. I got 2,231 first node relationships for Wang Shizhen. That's a lot. It's a lot, right? But then you say, but one moment, I know my Ming history, and I know Wang Shizhen dies in the 16th century, and I know that Song Lian dies in the Hongwu reign at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty. Why is he there? And the answer is because Wang Shizhen writes a preface to the works of Song Lian. So the fact that somebody writes a preface, now I could have, if I had said dynasties didn't matter, we'd see Su Shi appearing, Huang Tingzhen, all sorts of people from the Song Dynasty as well. Because we think that a relationship to somebody who's dead by writing a preface to their works or tiba or colophon on their painting or something is actually a very important indicator of what they care about, right? Social relationships define people and groups. And so the people in the past you choose to care about and write about are part of the world that you define, the social world you're defining with other people. And then I can take that and I could start to do a graph. Now, when I did my social network graph, I said, yeah, but I want to see I know this is about Wang Shizhen, I know, but I want to see other people within his network who have connections to other people. And so here, all of a sudden, I did that, and then I said, make those circles bigger if they have more connections. And so in this case, I did my minimum number of connections would be 2, but people like Tu Long, Li Weizhen, Wang Daokun, and so on, have lots of connections. So you see within somebody's network a bunch of subnetworks. But I could have gone and said, okay, now I've seen this, and Wang Shimao, of course, is his younger brother. I think it's his younger brother. I could take those other people and put their whole networks in here, and then we could have a very elaborate chart. But once you get to this level of these many people, it's actually the numbers that matter. And so you use your program to go to the data laboratory and see all the numbers of the relationship, the different kinds of centrality that exist. Or I could do this on a GIS. And the important thing about a GIS is it tells us very different kind of information from what we saw with the social network. It tells us in this case that while Wangshujian does have a national network, it is still preeminently a Jiangnan network, particularly around Suzhou and that area, and a little bit in northern Zhejiang. Oh yes, and Professor Campbell didn't mention that my latest book, which is on localizing learning, the literati enterprise, and this is a book about intellectual history, but I did sit down and try to make a serious use of the China Biographical Database. I discovered something very interesting. What I saw was that in the southern Song, in the 12th into the 13th century, right, the kinship networks of local people from Wuzhou, and I guess my N was around 2,200 people or something, were spread more or less nationally. They had a whole lot of people that came from the north, people in the west, and so on. And when we went into the Yuan, right, it was concentrated right in Wuzhou itself. Wuzhou in this case is the Wuzhou Jinhua Huote Nei Jinhua, right? Right down there in the southeast, right there. So that's well, there's actually some other historians have pointed out that there's changes in marriage networks and in official networks, Chan Sung, Bob Himes, and others. It was very, very, very pronounced, you would agree. But then I did something else. I looked at, in southern Song, the giant component. The giant component in the graph is the largest group of people who are all connected to each other. Right? And in this case, I'm looking at kinship networks based on 2211, which is 2 generations up, 2 generations down, 1 collateral, one marriage distance. And I got this. And here the colors are, except for gray, which is either we don't know or from outside, these are the colors of the counties, the 7 counties of Wuzhou. And what we see in this giant component is that, in fact, people are marrying across county lines. Now, my prediction is that in Yuan dynasty, when they don't marry nationally, they really marry locally, the giant component should be even more interconnected, right? Because they're not marrying nationally, they need local connections, and so those families ought to be marrying everybody within the prefecture. And this is the giant component that I got instead. And they're not marrying. They're separating. They're not marrying each other at all. They're marrying within the county. So the same thing we saw nationally, that is, they move away from national marriage to local marriage, turns out to be replicated within the prefecture. They turn away from prefectural marriage to local marriage. Now, there's an explanation for this. Read my book and you'll see it. But that raised for me another question. If relationships matter to literati, to elites, which they do, and if they're giving up their kinship relationships, what are they replacing it with? How do they have relationships? And so instead, what we find is they're going to collegiality. And that is that they are starting, so this was, what is this? Okay, this is the UN, and this is the social networks. Now, at first glance, you look at this and you say, oh, look, Southern Song and UN look pretty much the same, right? There's one difference that's very obvious, is that the most important person in Southern Song for Wuzhou social associations is not from Wuzhou. He's from Fujian, and it's Juxi. Lu Zuqian is the one from Wuzhou. Chanliang is from Wuzhou Wangbo. But by and large, most of the people here who are important to these local people are not from there. But when we get to Yuan, all the important people are local. Almost all, not all of them, but almost all of them. They're certainly the leading group. And there are numbers to prove that. But the important thing to look at is this. This is the number of persons in the query, right? From this period, the total records returned. Look at the change in the size of the giant component. It doubles in the Yuan dynasty. There's more connections between people in the Yuan dynasty. The number of edges, the number of relationships, multiple relationships increases. The percentage of the people in the giant component has increased. Average number of associations per year have all increased, right? Even though they're a few years less. So collegiality is making up for the breakdown of kinship. And I've learned something that I didn't expect, right? So when you learn something you don't expect, it's always, you can feel that you've learned something. It doesn't say much, but good. Now, this is the second part of my talk. And now I just have to be speedy because I've been meandering too long. So what's the most important difference that's taken place? It is the advent of artificial intelligence. It is absolutely crucial to the new digital humanities. And it will be our future in all fields. And it's become possible to do it in ways that are easy and complicated. At the moment, they're still complicated. And at Harvard, we've started to support a series of projects that allow us to do things with with artificial intelligence applied to Chinese texts. And I'm going to show you how that pushes history back to the humanities. But important issue is we're keeping full text as part of the system. We have the ability to zoom out to see a macro level patterns. This is the distant reading mode. To zoom into a particular document at the micro level and to do a close reading. And to integrate databases such as CBDB or QGID and use that to enhance discovery and analysis. Our historical sources are practical. If we see optimally what we'd like to be able to do with artificial intelligence, we'd like to include all machine-readable historical sources in the original language. Doesn't matter if it's punctuated or not, doesn't matter literary Chinese, modern Chinese. We want to make it possible to launch queries that identify the relevant documents. That is to say, I'm interested in the following problem. Tell me everything you know about it, or tell me everybody who's talked about that. And what are the documents that are most relevant to this? I want to be able to call up an analysis or a translation, depending on the language of my query, my prompt. In other words, if I prompt in English, I ought to get an English answer about Chinese text. If I prompt in Japanese, I ought to get a Japanese answer about Chinese text, or Chinese to Chinese and so on. And we want to support low-cost AI-assisted workflow for creating more reliable machine-readable texts. And we want to turn to modern scholarship as well. And by including all forms of modern scholarship, right, it makes it possible to take the knowledge about China created in modern scholarship and make it available to the world, to the natural language, and to include with that and connect it to the historical sources which were used to create that scholarship. That's the goal, the purpose. And the system that we're going to use to do that is something that's built like this, where you have a query which goes to your application, to your black box here, which is going to take that query and look at it in terms, let's say, of vectors or in keywords, entities. It's going to send it down to your knowledge base, that collection of texts that you've created, of machine-readable texts. It's going to find out the things that match. It's going to pull those out with our context, that is what's the document it's from, send it back to our black box there, which is going to send it over to one of the commercial LLMs, large language models, which have far more information than any one of us could put together, right? Which is billions and billions of dollars of work. And we're going to ask it to take these documents, take our question, put them together, and generate an answer, right? And generate an answer that responds to the question. And it generates that answer, it sends it back to our black box, and then gives it back to the user. But there are two ways of doing this. And one way is called, they're both called reference augmented, well, I'll tell you about this more in a second, but reference retrieval augmented generation, RAG. But the key terms in this are large language models of various kinds. Some of you, almost all of you, probably have played around the ChatGPT and things like this. So GPT-4.0, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, Deep 6 version 2, and so on. It involves generative pre-trained transformers, which is a machine learning algorithm, and crucially, the private knowledge base that we put together. Right? RAG is a technique that improves your LLM output because it tells you in its answer what the source is for the answer. This is crucial, particularly when we're doing including modern scholarship. It will cite your work and tell people to go read your book, read your article. Vector similarity search. Suppose you have a question and all those words exist in relationship to other words, and you can turn that into numbers. And suppose you have your private knowledge base, which is a bunch of texts, and you turn all of those into numbers. This is high computational power that is beyond me. And what we're doing is taking my query, converted now into vectors, and running it against our private knowledge base, exists as vectors, and getting an answer to what matches, which is then sent, the particular answer, things that match are then sent to the LLM to be composed into an answer to my question. And then we have another thing called a graph retrieval augmented generation, which is very different system, but does some of the same things. Suppose you wrote an article and you isolated every single entity in the article. By entity, I mean an important word, a concept, a place, a name, anything else, right? And you depicted that as a graph, like a social network, a knowledge graph. And there'd be certain words that you come back to again and again, or concepts you come back to again and again. That's to be a bigger circle, right? Other ones less. Right? And so I could then look at the graph and say, oh, these are the things that I'm interested in. Now, I'm going to show you an example. I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit over. Again, so I'm going to my knowledge base, which consists of knowledge graphs and vectors, right? I can do both, but they're separate, different kinds of queries. And so in this case, we took the 1G, the literary collection of Yang Ting-he, an official, the father of the more famous Yang Shen, and we did a vector analysis, vectorized it, and we did a graph analysis, right? And now I'm first going to use the vector analysis. I'm going to use RAG. And I ask a question. What did Yang Ting think were the four most important issues facing the dynasty? And it comes back with this answer. Well, he doesn't say. Right? In the provided context, there is no specific mention of four most important issues facing the dynasty as identified by Yang Ting-he. However, from various documents and discussions presented, we can infer some of the critical concerns that he had and his contemporaries addressing during his time. These include 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's listed the documents in his 1G that this comes from. And then I saw, okay, there's one called Political Administrative Leadership. This is very good. And actually, we had somebody who's written a book on Yang Ting come and talk with us about this to make sure it was very good. And I wanted to know this political administrative leadership in this piece called Qingban Shi Shu. What was that about? And so I said, analyze this. And it comes back and gives me a whole analysis of that document. I could have asked it for a translation. I could have asked it to translate it into French or Korean or whatever, right? And it would have done that. So that is why RAG is going to change the way we do it. Now, what I want you to think of is that we just did this with one literary collection, and a short one, only 8 yuan. We're working now to do it on 25, and our plan is to do it for 300 from the Ming Dynasty and late Yuan and early Qing, all machine readable, and see what happens then. Because then we can turn, we can turn it into, we can also do a graph, knowledge graph. When we do a knowledge graph, now we're finding out the things that Yang Tingyuan cares a lot about, right? And we say, oh, so he's writes a little bit about the Empress Dowager, but he has much more to say about the Li Bu, the Ministry of Rights, or the Ministry of War. And so it's sort of, the Ministry of Rights is over here, Ministry of War is far away, which makes sense. And it's organized all those entities in his documents to create this knowledge graph. And now imagine that I ask for a graph that includes all the people who he is contemporary with. Now I can start to reconstruct the kinds of political debates they were having and the documents I need to study further. And then I can bring in the China Biographical Database, which mentions 30 different social associations of Yang Tinghe, and say, oh yeah, include those people, explore those people. At this point, I'm starting to get fairly complicated stuff. And then I take this stuff, I just take the Yang Tinghe 1G, and I give it to this LLM and I create a podcast. You want to hear the podcast?
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into Ming Dynasty China today with a guy named Yang Tingye. This
He doesn't know how to pronounce the
talk to
name.
the emperor.
This is all
We're
machine
talking
voice.
strongly worded suggestions here.
Oh, absolutely.
So we've got this collection of his writings called Memorials to the Throne, and we're going to see what they tell us about him and the politics of the time.
No picture.
What were these memorials exactly? Like strongly worded emails.
Think of them more like very formal letters presented directly to the emperor, sometimes even read aloud in court. Can you imagine?
Oh, okay. A bit higher stakes than...
And so it goes, right? And since it's fairly reliable, it was very reliable. Well, after that, I did it with the entire Analects of Confucius. Said, give me a lecture on Confucius. And I liked the lecture. I thought it was pretty good. I'm going to stop teaching. No need. So let me get back here. Schmidt Sciences, one of the large foundations private foundations devoted to funding the sciences and breakthrough research, is now going to be making investments in AI for the humanities. And I was just at a meeting in Oxford that they organized, 70 people from around the world to talk, one from Hong Kong as well, to talk about AI for the humanities and how it should be funded, which basically means find ways of giving me money, and all my friends and everyone else, right? So very briefly, there's such a thing called cyber infrastructure, which is how do you create the links between all the different digital projects. This is very strong for the natural sciences. There's no real cyber infrastructure for the social sciences or the humanities. And they're strong for the sciences because the United States government funds it. But we had a conference in Shanghai attended by several universities from Hong Kong as well, including this one, about how do we create a cyber infrastructure for Chinese historical studies. From there, thanks to the work of Donald Sturgeon, one of the co-organizers with me of the conference, we started to develop something called TextRef, which allows you to find all the works that have been digitized and are available for download or for scanned, machine readable, whatever, on both in CTEX and Carnegie Hill, but a number of other institutions as well. We did this for biography, so you can find biographies of various people as they are available in different programs. And we thought of ways in which we sort of link up CText, China Biographical Database, Marcus, which marks up text, and so on. We had a conference you can take, if you capture that QR code, there were 140 presentations, 350 people on the digital transformation of scholarship, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and for that, we're going to create something called Digital China Worldwide, which makes it possible for people to look at, to present their work, their projects, and make it available to others. And you can go to that and take a look at what's there. You'll see pages like this, which have projects and so on. We've been working on how to create a common DH curriculum that goes from creating machine-readable text all the way to digital publishing, but along the way introduces the use of AI at various points as well. And that's what we have in mind. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Peter, for this amazing talk. And I see, actually, we have a great audience, and we have time for questions. And we have two people who will be helping with the microphones. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Peter, shall I serve as a sort of chair? And
You can, absolutely.
And then, okay.
Yeah.
So go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get the microphone to you. And please identify yourself when you ask the question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jing. I'm actually an MBA student. So I have a question on the regular expression thing you mentioned. So I think, is all the regular expression thing done under English text? No?
Oh, no, it's on Chinese text. I just did the English translation for audiences that don't read Chinese.
Okay, oh, that makes sense, because I was thinking because I learned regular expression in the programming language in English, right? So I think if you run that regular expression on English text, the amount of translation would be crazy. So,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Although, AI translates very well
Okay,
and translates literary Chinese and classical Chinese very well.
okay.
But no, we ran it on entirely on the Chinese text.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank
Yeah,
you.
right. Questions here?
Hi, actually, just a follow-up question to the regular expression. So I was just wondering, would you consider using models like named entity recognition rather than regular expression?
Sure.
And
sure.
I was wondering, has that been done by the team, and
Yes.
how did that work out?
So actually, it's a combination. Originally, it was a combination of regular expressions and named entity recognition, where, for example, we have a list. I'll give you an example. We have a list of all the place names in a dynasty for the Tangsong Yuan Ming Qing. And so we're looking at Qing sources, and we just basically say, identify all these places. The problem is that in China, Xian level can have the same name. Prefecture level, Fu, Zhou, never have the same name. So you get some disambiguation problems coming up, but named entity recognition is fine. However, neither regular expressions nor named entity recognition. There's the one area where we failed with this. We could do dates perfectly, capture every date that appears in any document. Kinship is pretty good. The one thing that we couldn't do, that we failed at, was social associations. So Cui Lekang's biography, Professor Cui's biography mentions Cameron Campbell, but what's the relationship between them, right? In fact, we as a reader of the biography can figure that out pretty easily. We can see it right away. Trying to design a computer program that would figure that out turned out to be very difficult. And so we started to use transformers, something called BERT, and then another version called Roberta. And those are significant improvements, but AI beats them all, right? And so we're actually switching to AI-based prompts to figure out what the relationships are. And it's very good at that, right?
Can I take the privilege to ask one?
Please.
Yeah. Hi. So I'm quite interested in. Yeah. Okay. I'm Yu Yue. I'm an MPhil student in the computer science program, and I'm interested in whether the LLM that you can perceive can be used in the large-scale micro data for the social science, because you mentioned, like, for Yang Tinghe, it's like a celebrity that everyone knows. But like, I'm not promoting for the Jingshen Lu, but we have millions of data that like, it's impossible for us to know every individual in
Absolutely.
the data set. So how do you like perceive or the observe the patterns in the microdata. Yeah.
So we have, and the same thing would be true of genealogy, right? But looking at family and kinship differently. Depends what patterns. It's really a question, I think, of what patterns we're looking for. So one of the things we have, and if we put the Jinshanlu data with what we have in the China Biographical Database, one of the things we get to know, and you have this, I think, for a lot of the Jinshanlu data, is how the person entered government service, right? And you know, if we have it from CBDB, where they come from, right? What's their Jiguan, right? And then you start to ask the question, what's the relationship between place of appointment and where a person is a native, right? And are there patterns of distribution? Another question is, we know that the Jinshu examination cannot possibly provide the number of officials you need to run the government, right? So it's filled with Jiansheng and Gongsheng and people like this, right? And again, so what kinds of offices do they hold? What's the relationship between where they're from and the office they hold, right? And that turns out to be patterned as well. Even more patterned. With Jinshu move all over the country, it seems. But people with lesser degrees are far more regionalized. And is that an answer to your question? Or not quite?
Yes, partly, and for a more technical side, so you are talking about the distribution, which is more like a statistical part,
right.
But like for the transformer or other large language models,
we
are also want the model to understand our data set, not like write code to help us analyze. So like ideally, I want the model to like read the data set and tell me everything from its perspective. Yeah.
Okay, so we haven't tried that. We've done that with. There's been a little bit of work. I'll give you an example. This is actually from something that Mike Sony, one of his students, did. So he had these land contracts from Xiamen, from near Xiamen, right, in the Yongtai, I guess, in Fujian. And the question was whether there were kinship connections between people mentioning these different land contracts. And by reading it, they could not tell, right? And so they put this into an LLM and got an analysis and got an analysis back saying, oh, yeah, these people are connected as follows. But it still wasn't apparent to them why that was so. And so it asked, the next prompt was, explain your reasoning. And it explained the reasoning, and it was convincing, right? So that would be a very micro result, but again, led by a prompt. So the question you then ask is, will a prompt, can you find ways where we don't know the answer already, or where we don't know the question, and we want to figure out what the question is, right? And that's where I think graph RAG is going to be much more important, because it says, look, this is all your data, this is my analysis of your data, this is how I see the distribution of entities within your data, and we get then to look and say, oh, I didn't expect that. So now you've given me, I don't bring the keywords, you've given me the keywords. If you think back to some early work that was done by Jing Guantao on looking at large data sets of periodical literature. And the way he approached it was he had a set of keywords that he already knew, and more or less what he found confirmed what he already knew, because he was asking for those words. What it didn't do at that point, but what we now could do, right, is say, well, what are the terms, what are the entities that appear in that data set? And that gives us in a kind of, let me use the word that's more objective than subjective, right? That we can now see what is coming up in that data. But again, we're really at the beginning of this. And I have to emphasize that once we start to go from 1G, Wang Shizhen's 1G is over 100 yuan long, right? Once we go to 25 1G or 300 1G from a period by people who are connected to each other by social and kinship ties, the amount of computational power we're going to need is going to start to cost real money. And if we set this up so we make it possible for anybody to go in to the platform and do a query. If it's only us, us scholars who are doing it, it's fine. But suppose people say, oh, I can look at find out things about my family, my relatives. All of a sudden, thousands of people start to use it, and our AWS, Amazon Web Services fees go up, our ChatGPT fees go up, because you can feed lots of information into ChatGPT, and it's very inexpensive. But when the information comes back, you have to pay again, and it's much more expensive. So we face, I think, real challenges, right? Real challenges with this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Wen Kai.
Hi, Wonkai.
Yeah, I'd like to bring the question to your part two about the humanities, because when I read Quentin Skinner's work on contextualized intellectual history, and it seems like he's doing all this connect work and then to see what the text shared and how they use the same words without using all this digital humanity technique.
Right.
Yeah. So, but in that case, as intellectual historians, you do need to interpret those terms in different contexts and in the networks. But then in all this machine learning project, it seems like the interpretation is not very deep. Whether the interpretation could get the nuance of in there. So I'm just wondering, how is this digital humanity technique is also pushing this contextualized intellectual histories in these directions?
So if we go back to the Yang He example, where my prompt was, tell me 4 big things he's concerned about with government. First of all, I began by saying 4. And I said it was about government, and it came back with an answer. But the question then is, do I go and analyze those documents? Right? It's not as if, so I guess I would put it like this. For some things, it's going to give you the answers, right? So-and-so is related to so-and-so. For other things, it's going to say, you might want to look at this and think about this, right? So there are a lot of Ming-Wenji, right? They're actually on the order of 3,000 extant Wenji. So I'm using a small corpus from Siku of 300, machine readable, not punctuated, but it doesn't matter. What I can't do is read all of those Wenji at once, right? And having spent many years reading Wenji, right, and doing intellectual history, what I might like to do is work by topic rather than by person. And it's very hard to work by topic, right? Unless you have everybody in mind, right? And so this is, what I find attractive in this, is the potential to start to think about intellectual history in terms of topics, terms, and things like this, rather than beginning from the angle of an individual person. So I think that, in some sense, gets us towards a deeper reading. Again, what I think has happened here is that close reading is not closed out. Close reading becomes part of the story, right? Close reading and distant reading can live together. And that's why I think AI is pushing history back into the humanities and into language and relationships between words. Because after all, the LLM works by seeing relationships between words, right? It thinks that certain words belong together. And that's how it's able to generate answers to queries. So it really is a language model. And language models are the nature of the humanities, as Skinner and Pocock and others would say. Hi, Lawrence.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Zhang. I'm associate professor here. I have a question sort of related to that earlier one. It's about the illusion of certainty or data, right? And this maybe relates more to the quantitative history business than AI, but AI is going to give us that illusion very soon, which is that increasingly you see a number of people who are not historians by training, who are perhaps less skeptical of historical sources than we are, using this vast amounts of data, producing conclusions about the past that us historians would look at and go, are you sure about this, right? And because there is that illusion of certainty, of both the quantity and the quality of the data. People are just using and maybe misusing those, and in some ways, LLM is going to give us that maybe in a few years' time. Maybe it's not quite there yet.
I think we're there.
Yeah, I think we're almost there. But how do you see our role or our ability to deal with this issue? And I don't know, when are you going to write an AHR article to to lecture us about it?
So my first encounter with this was, I guess, the year before last. Very smart student had to take a history course to graduate. Is in my history course. She was a STEM student. She was actually doing life sciences, and she hands in a paper about the Mudanting and the Peony Pavilion, the late Ming play. And the paper was interesting. It was smart, but it had around 15 references. And I started to look, and I said, "Oh." So I knew all the people that she was citing, right? But I looked at the first one. And I said, I'm pretty sure she didn't write exactly that article, but let me check. And so I wrote to her and said, did you ever? She sounds like me, but no. 10 out of the 15 references were faked. And so I told the student this, and the student said, no, that's not true. They're not. They're accurate references. She insisted, right? I said, no, you go and look. And then she fessed up and said, oh, yeah, well, I said, so explain how but first she had said, they can't be wrong because this is how I write all my science papers. And the way, so this is how she wrote the paper. She writes the paper, generated from her head, and then she takes paragraph by paragraph or sentence by sentence and says to an LLM, ChatGPT in this case, give me a reference for this. So how come it worked in her science papers? Remember, she's doing life sciences. Why would it work for the life sciences and not work? Well, let's assume it did work for the life sciences, and my colleague in the life sciences read the paper, and things. I'm not sure of that, but still. But the reason why it probably worked for life sciences is because there's something called PubMed, which is this enormous database of everything written about life sciences, maintained at great cost by the federal government. And that's all public knowledge. And so that's already in the LLM. And so it just generates things that are appropriate for that, based on the vectorization of prompts, right? So I turned her into the administrative board for suitable punishment. And interestingly, they said, gave it back to me and said, solve this within your course. I said, so this is not illegal? This is illegal? This is just a minor infraction? And I think they were appalled by the number of things at times this was happening, and they thought the statistics would look bad because we just had a president. No, that was before the president was accused of plagiarism. But in fact, that's the reason, because they announced a couple weeks later that the number of plagiarism cases had gone down, when actually they had gone way, way up, right? So what do we do? What do we do? False certainty, right? Apparent objectivity is treated with one result is hallucinations by the LLMs, right? That's why RAG and GraphRag are so important, because citing the source is key to this. Citing the source and being able to analyze the source further is key. Right? That's our best bet, I think, for trying to get some control of this. One guy? On this point.
Yeah, yes. I want to follow with Lawrence's question here, because I think one very interesting example is like when the officials have their biographies, like, oh, I'm Jiguan is one place and that place, right? But actually, they turn out they live in the capital cities, but not in their Jiguan. And this is actually even true today. But right. Then when you have all this information with this Jiguan, and then people use this coded information of Jiguan, and then began to make causal stories. I think this is what Lawrence is really concerned. Yeah.
Okay, and so we have one of the things we've learned with the biographical database is we have to allow multiple answers to the question of what's the person's Jiguan. right? Because we in fact find multiple answers, right? And some places are, logi, some places are they're living, some places are where they say they're from, or where their ancestors are from. And so you want to keep that open for multiple possibilities. And then the question is, do you rank them or not, right? How do you rank them? So one question I think we're going to have to ask as we can do better with sources is, and as we include more sources, is to really keep refining the databases and say, what is more, is there more reliable information? Yeah.
But it's not an issue of sources or reliability of the sources, but rather in the people who are using it not caring about those distinctions. That's a big difference, right?
Yeah, so if look, once you can generate a podcast with these sexy voices talking about Chinese history, right? Based on a source, I expect that to happen a lot. And so we're going to be in a world which is going to be absolutely filled with fake news. But I think we were always filled with fake news. When I was younger and began to study China, I realized that nothing I read in American newspapers about China was right? It was just filled with misinformation and prejudices and things like that. So, and much less Chinese newspapers about China, right? So, what do we do about the fact that there is bad information out there? There's false information. We try to have good information. And again, one of the reasons for, this has actually been something I've thought about for a long time, which is one of the responsibilities of universities is to try to generate reliable information as best they can. Is it going to be perfect? No. Is it better than people making things up? Yes. But Wikipedia has developed a system to try to curate, by crowdsourcing the curation of information. And I would say that there's more information about Chinese history in Wikipedia in greater detail than any set of lectures on Chinese history I could give. But the value of somebody's lectures on Chinese history is they thread these disparate pieces of information together. That still is the act of interpretation, right? And so how we interpret at a macro level is also motivated by our particular understanding and interests. An economic historian does not look at history the same way an intellectual historian does. They ask different questions. And that will remain true. I don't have a solution. There's no perfect world, Lawrence.
I think we have, we're at time, but I would like, if you'll bear with us, Josh Derman, our head of the Division of Humanities, has maybe one last question. Josh, why don't you go away?
Thanks. I just have a question that's related, I think, to the one that Wenkai asked earlier. But I wanted to go back to the Civil War in Coursera, which you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, where words are bartered and lose their meaning. And if I remember right from the Peloponnesian War, what happens on the island of Coursera is that not only does language break down, but values break down. So something which might have previously been considered reprehensible, like ruthlessness, suddenly becomes elevated to a moral virtue, that you want a leader to be ruthless, whereas previously maybe this would have been morally frowned upon. And
you're talking about the American election, right?
That too. Well, these transvaluations of values happen all the time. Right. And if you don't understand, or if you're not part of the language game or part of the culture, and you don't understand not just the linguistic context, but the lived context, it can be hard to know whether ruthlessness, might be a praised value or a frowned upon, moral failing. And it kind of makes me wonder about the limitations of a large language model for understanding precisely the kind of meaning that you introduced at the beginning of your talk as being essential to the humanities. Is it possible to understanding meaning outside of some kind of attempt to think of yourself as the participant in a culture?
So I guess a very short way of answering that. Let me try to give a yes answer, right? rather than saying, well, we're lost. And so the yes answer is that words are related to other words, which the large language model recognizes, which is fundamental to the humanities. Right? The words are related to other words, and words cluster. And so in somebody's usage of language, the way they use language will, in fact, generate particular clusterings. This is, again, modeling, right? AI modeling, where words of a certain kind are put together, not on the basis of general usage, ruthlessness, let's say, being good or bad, but in the case of the individual whose words we have, sorting out the fact that ruthlessness for this person was not a virtue, but was something that was reprehensible. Whereas we see in other people, it starts to move in the direction of virtue. Right? That's based on word clustering, right? Which would seem to be a way of getting at that context in which an individual has, or individuals, put meaning into words. So I think it's not impossible to talk about that. There is one person I mentioned to you today who will be in Hong Kong beginning in October at HKU. Chen Yuxi has been working a little bit on that. And it's worth thinking more about it and asking her that question. Again, AI is something I'm just beginning to try to understand more of, but there are people who understand it much better than me. Okay, good. Well, thank you all very much for coming today. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.